Thank you so much for coming today. It's a treat to be here and to see a couple of familiar faces and a bunch of brand new folks. So thanks for making the time. I have to admit that when Betsy contacted me about giving a talk at the Portland Art Museum, I was definitely hesitant about playing the role of sort of what I thought it would be like, playing the role of kind of a curator or perhaps an expert on a piece of work or an artist. And she assured me that that wasn't what the talk was about. And so I said, okay, great. But just in general, thinking about what the museum had to offer at this point, my own personal work seems like it's veering more in the realm of folk art, and that's my personal interpretation of it. And then I have this monstrous business project, which is Wildcraft Studio School. So most of my time is spent up there kind of organizing classes and working with teachers and trying to accommodate both teachers and students and make sure that everyone has a really interesting experience up with us. So Wildcraft, for those that are hearing about us for the first time, is an art studio and a school that offers seasonal workshops in traditional skills, craft, design, and herbal medicine. So it's a wide range of things. And we've been open for 3 years. We're opening our third season just last weekend, and we're open from April through November, and they're all, again, workshops for adults. So you can take a look through that catalog and kind of get a sense. This weekend, to give you just a description of two very diverse classes that we're offering, we've got this amazing ethnobotanist and herbalist named Elise Crone, who's coming up to teach us spring foraging of wild greens. So we'll be out in the forest all day looking at the native plants and some of the invasive species in white salmon and turning them into food and medicine. And so that's sold out on Saturday. And then on Sunday, we've got an amazing younger woman named Stephanie Wood, who is coming from the Willamette Valley. She is a member of the Grand Ronde tribe, and she's teaching a traditional basket weaving, cedar and sedge basket weaving class, and that's also sold out. So two very different things, but you can kind of get a sense that the interest of Wildcraft is really about digging into a particular location and a landscape and getting your hands into something. So a little bit longer of an intro to that than I was thinking about, but this invitation to speak really gave me an opportunity and set me kind of on this interesting journey thinking about the past 10 years, going from being a young artist, young art student really, into grad school, and then kind of immediately becoming a teacher to other young students, and then kind of striking out on my own and then becoming a business owner. So very different progression, and moreover, it really has given me the chance to reconnect with an artist, and I'm going to use her name the way that it would be traditionally in the United States, not in Japan, because she lived here for so many years, so Mayumi Oda. To reconnect with an artist who represents really my ideal of someone whose craft and life have woven together to create something that's really much greater than the individual parts. So I'm going to spend more time tonight speaking about her life and the culture that supports these pieces more than the formal aspect of the pieces themselves. So before transitioning to speaking about her history and the work that's on display behind me, just would like to give a little bit more of a personal background on myself, and hope that that sort of informs how her work really very deeply resonated with me. So I grew up in a small town in coastal Rhode Island. My dad was and is a writer, really zany kind of idea maker. My mother, probably the hardest working woman I've ever met, as a nurse when I was growing up and as a hospital administrator. We didn't have a TV. I grew up essentially as an only child with two half-sisters way out on the opposite coast in California. And so I got a lot of attention, as it were, which is a blessing. Mostly, I mean, for me, it was a really wonderful blessing. My dad really took it upon himself to make sure that I was enrolled in every single possible art class, craft class, anything that we had. So from community classes all the way up to taking me up to Providence, which was about 45 minutes away from where we lived, to go to the Rhode Island School of Design in the evenings to take the community education classes. So I basically grew up as a young person up at RISD, taking those classes with adults and other children my age, depending on what class it was. And so as I got older, it seemed really predetermined to everyone, except for me, that I would, of course, be applying to the Rhode Island School of Design. That's where I would be going to undergrad. In my mind, I was looking at Warren Wilson. I'm not sure, has anyone ever heard of Warren Wilson? It's a farming college in the mountains of North Carolina. It has a loose affiliation with the Black Mountain College. So if that sounds familiar to anyone. So yeah, I was looking into farming, and I was looking into agriculture, and I was looking into all these things. And of course, still drawing and doing all of that stuff on the side. So needless to say, I ended up at RISD, as these things go, and graduated in 2005. I focused on drawing, painting, printmaking, basically observational skills were really what I spent most of my time doing there. And in the summers, I worked on a farm in coastal Rhode Island. So I kind of had both of these sort of varying needs met. It sounds pretty idyllic and dreamy, and it was. But I had this, of course, being a young person and being sort of a serious young person, I had this really nagging preoccupation. It's like, how do I bring these lives together? I want to be this, amazing, creative, fantastic artist, and I want to make everything and whatever, but I also really want to spend time outside, and I want to farm, and I want to be connected with the landscape and all of that. And it sounds even funny to say those things as if they are opposites, when really they're just sort of very easy to combine. But in my mind, this was a nagging preoccupation. Also kind of lodged in my brain was this idea that any art worth looking at had a relationship to the contemporary urban condition. So, in other words, kind of connecting to this irritating idea that really floats around still, really kind of has residue even in today's young artists, that in order to be a successful and strong and effective artist, you have to kind of be a little bit tormented, right? This doesn't sound unfamiliar. Does this sound sort of familiar? Yeah, it is, and it really is, but it's incredible. In 5 years of teaching undergrad at PNCA and working with 18, 19, 20-year-olds, the seed is still there. They sort of have this thing, like they have to be kind of moody, and they have to struggle. They have to really struggle. They can't just make something fantastic and be happy, which, so I was one of them, and whatever. And so it really took, backing up, what I really truly loved spending time doing was being outside, again, farming, and then coming in and collecting whatever had been around me, plants, critters, bones, whatever it might have been, and just simply drawing them. Fairly straightforward, sometimes interpreting, but just simple observation. And this worked for me, and of course it didn't really work in school. So drawing for the sake of drawing, or kind of the amateur botanical drawing, the still life, the landscape, none of these things were really starting points for contemporary conversations. Nor did they really evidence any adequate internal torment. So anyway, jumping ahead kind of to the grad school years, I can really thank grad school for one thing specifically, which was sort of curing me of this issue of, I have to have all of this sort of struggle and whatever. It was after 2 years of critiques and conversations that were really challenging and often sometimes fairly draining. I left school with an MFA degree and a resolve that I would do anything in the world except try to be an artist. So it kind of cured me really quickly of this problem, which was, how do I be an artist and live this other life? It's like, oh, I don't need to. And I know the quickest way to get away from art is to start a business. It's like, okay, I'm going to start a business. So I started a business and had a textile design business for a handful of years, and then started another business pretty much immediately. And that's what the current business I'm in, Wildcraft Studio School, is what got me out of the city with ease and out into the hills of White Salmon, Washington. Somewhere in starting the business and running the business and filling classes and making all that hustle that happens, doing a lot of drywall, which I might add in there. Somewhere in all of that, I just lost the concern about these kind of divided lives, which is really nice. And anyway, so giving this presentation really gave me a second to reflect on that. The background aside, when I came into the museum to take a walk around a few weeks ago and decide what piece I wanted to talk about, I was so thrilled to come into this exhibition and just be surrounded by prints, feeling that kind of kindred spirit of printmaking. And part of that is shops, printmaking shops. Are any of you printmakers? Or yeah, okay, so you might have that experience that unless you have a home studio, often shops are these communal spaces. People work together, you take care of equipment together. Sometimes you need help if you're pulling big prints or whatever. So that's sort of an instant community in just the tools and the equipment. And additionally, I feel a real connection to other printmakers in part because of the focus on labor and repetitive work that's required to create these editions. It really does take a particular kind of artist to want to make work that is repetitive for one, but also then when you consider making an edition of 70, of 100, of 200, you really end up just working, and you're working with your body, and it's incredibly repetitive. So there's some sort of connection in just that it does take a very specific kind of artist to want to do that work. So again, I was just thrilled to walk into this exhibition. And Mayumi Oda's pieces are the only screen printed works that are part of this exhibit. The curator, Mary Beth, described the technique of screen printing as really well suited to the kind of imagery, this kind of playful quality of her work, which you can see in this piece here and in these pieces as well. It looks as though, to me, when I was kind of examining this work, that you could have used a lot of direct stencil methods, which you're drawing right on the screen with drawing fluid. Again, this was the late 70s and early 80s, and so many of the techniques have not changed that much. Some of them have, and so I think there were more people, it was more common to use direct stencil techniques. So when you see aspects that feel a lot like painting in here, or a lot like drawings, just hand-drawn line, she may have been drawing right on the screen. She also may have been working with inks on layers of mylar or waxy kind of crayons, so that the quality and the touch of that mark making wasn't lost through any digital reproductions, as it sometimes can be today. Not always, but. Her work employs a formally distinctive characteristic of fluid painterly lines, these really flat shapes. So, there is very rarely an attempt in any of her pieces to really develop form in this round, kind of gradated way, though she does use split fountain printing, which is, if you can see the color gradation that goes from this very light purple into this darker green, it's one layer of ink, and she's pulling multiple colors down to create this sort of fluid wave. It's very common in Japanese woodblock printing that you can see in other examples around the room. But specifically, these very, very fluid and painterly lines, really good example in here, probably are what earned her the title, the Matisse of Japan. Do people see that kind of connection between the two work? Yeah. And so that's very appealing in combination with sort of sense of a paper cut or this solid sort of shape. So those are very distinctive elements in almost all of her work, formal elements, which is where I'm starting. Her family, she was raised in Japan in a strict Buddhist family, which becomes a really important part of her life in later years. She studied fine art and traditional Japanese fabric dyeing at the Tokyo University of Fine Arts, and also worked really closely with masters in kimono dyeing, traditional kimono dyeing. And people have written about her work, and on her personal website, it talks specifically about that as an influence of the color, her color palette, and also just the flatness. You can also see repeated patterns in the textiles. I think in here, she uses a sort of printed, flat printed quality that you would find in a traditional Japanese textile. And that's throughout. So in moments where her figures are wearing clothing, there's very often sort of printed pattern on the clothing. And just in general, the evidence of the textile, her background in textiles, can be seen through the sense of an all-over repeat. So that's kind of where it's not a gridded pattern, but where it sort of feels like it's flowing from one aspect to another. And so that's another very similar thing across her work. So Mayumi married an American PhD student who was studying in Tokyo and moved with him to the East Coast. That's how she got over stateside, lived there a number of years until their marriage dissolved, and she brought her 2 young children to Marin County and connected with Green Gulch Farm. And this is where her work and her background gets really interesting for me. Green Gulch, is that a familiar name for folks, Green Gulch Farm? Yeah. No. So Green Gulch was and still is one of the 2 outposts of the San Francisco Zen Center that was created in the early 60s. The San Francisco Zen Center was one of the first, or the first actually, Zen outposts in the United States. So that was the beginning of Zen Buddhism in the States. It was in San Francisco, and Green Gulch Farm was an outpost. It had a Zen center, and still does, and was also a working farm that supplied restaurants like Chez Panisse, Alice Waters. That whole scene also began there, which is really interesting. Tassajara, which may be familiar to people, is another outpost to the San Francisco Zen Center. So back to Green Gulch just for a quick second. If you've ever driven on that coastal highway, you're leaving San Francisco, you're cruising up through that amazing eucalyptus gorge. It opens up, and on one side of you, you've got hillsides, cliffs, and they're covered in, depending the season, lupin or California poppy, sage, toyon, all of these plants that have this really, really incredible smell. And then to the side of you is just this drop of a little valley, and then the Pacific Ocean. So Green Gulch is tucked in there, and that's the backdrop for this piece in particular, and a lot of Mayumi's work that was created in the late 70s and early 80s. She spent a number of years there and raised 2 of her children there. So a little bit more on that, how it connects to me back this sort of funny grad school moment. I'm in my first semester of grad school. It's Christmas break, that moment when you're supposed to kind of rest and relax and take in everything you've done. Instead, you're kind of stressing and thinking, like, who am I? What am I doing with my life? What am I doing with my work? And my dad, dear old dad, sends me an article that he's clipped out from the New York Times. And it is the focus of the article is on the resurgence of organic farming and agriculture among young people currently. And so how overwhelmingly young people are flocking back to these kind of rural areas and taking up farming. And they mentioned Green Gulch Farm in it as having this really amazing apprenticeship. And so for longer than a moment, I'm kind of pondering this and kind of couldn't bring myself to see what in that was so valuable. And yet, it's kind of right in front of me, but I can't see it at the time. I'm thinking, this doesn't relate to my own work. How does this relate to my own work? It doesn't. So instead, I go to the opposite end of the coast, back to the East Coast, to the Haystack Mountain School of Crafts, which probably sounds familiar, to take an epic course on machine knitting. And it's sort of comical now, just to think about it, but that I own a studio that has this gigantic garden, and farming and agriculture and sustainable practices are so deeply rooted in what I'm doing right now. And yet we also have looms and knitting machines and all of that stuff. So there it is, kind of gathered together, all in one place. So let's see where I'm off to. Okay, so another funny little link to Mayumi's work. I didn't realize that for years I had been living with this cookbook, which maybe some of you have also lived with. This is the Tassajara recipe book, and her drawing is on the cover of it. And so it's just this very, very sweet way to think that her work kind of has seeped into so many people's lives and connected people like me that, I have no religious practice to speak of, and certainly no Buddhist practice to speak of. And Tassajara and that connection has sort of reached all of these different people through her design, which I know is the only reason I bought that book at whatever thrift store that I bought it at, however many years ago. So the work, she's been a prolific creator, has made what looks like hundreds and hundreds of pieces. If you just a quick perusal through her website, and you can see just endless iterations of the goddess and simple portraits of plants and flowers and things like that. The pieces that really speak the most to me are depicting scenes that feel like snippets of her daily life or of daily life. A portrait of melons in the garden, a little patch of borage with covered in flies or bees or whatever. These scenes of simplicity, like in this piece over here, really excellent example of, again, her characteristic, very loose brushstroke, bold use of color, flat spaces, but the content, again, is just what could be potentially a very mundane moment in one's daily life, right? So you have this beautiful garden and you're out weeding. And yet through that use of color and form and just the way that your eye can move through the page, through all of her line work, she's elevating this to be this experience that's worthy of making a huge diptych of. And in addition, not just a diptych, but an addition of 45 of these, so 45 of each of these pieces. A part of this piece that I really love that kind of, again, roots her in this particular climate are these moments of sort of silver, this reflective silver that I interpret as that really heavy, low-hanging fog that kind of permeates. We all know it from the Pacific Northwest, but also permeates in that Northern California climate. In a book that she wrote that is also has this image gracing the cover of it. It's called I Opened the Door Laughing, and it's a personal kind of memoir of her spiritual journey. I bought the last copy at Powell's, so don't bother. She talks about how she spent years and years and years fighting this climate, trying to grow tomatoes and peppers and all of these like gorgeous hot weather plants. And one day in the fog, it just sort of dawned on her that that fog was what gave her collard greens and kales and arugulas and tender leafy stuff for 9 months out of the year. And so just, again, one of these really small moments that I feel very poignantly connected to living all the way up in the Columbia River Gorge, trying to grow these sort of tender, lovely things and watching them get beat down by the wind, you know, season after season. So moving from formal aspects of her work, another really common element in her pieces is the use of the female figure. I don't know in all of the work that I saw if I've ever seen a male figure in any of her work. Anyone can correct me about that. That's just through looking through her website and the pieces here. Her focus is so incredibly female-centric. So you have pieces like this one here, Helen of Troy, where it's female character taking on this sort of historical role or the role of the goddess, depicting the goddess. That's common throughout. Another very common feature is women that are either completely undressed or topless. And to me, very often, I think in at least Western artwork, you can kind of see this and feel like they are in the process of being undressed, or there's sort of a voyeuristic quality. And for me, I don't feel that way looking at her work at all. It almost feels like the women that are here are existing in this like pure natural state, as if they were placed on earth like this, not just placed on the page. So there's a certain level of comfort, expression, sort of a lack of self-consciousness, I suppose. That's how I would interpret her use of the female form and sort of the nude female form really as celebratory more than anything else. Which, you know, you can't get around seeing that as separate from this culture, again, in the lifestyle that she was living. We're talking about Marin County, communal living, late 70s, early 80s. She lived, when she was at Green Gulch, lived with a group of other single mothers who were raising a pile, just a wild pack of kids, it sounded like, waking at dawn for meditation, working in the garden, tending to the children, also tending to visitors of the Zen Center. So from all accounts, it feels like it was really a moment of true exploration for her personally, and then also artistically in those early years of the San Francisco Zen Center, Green Gulch, Tassajara, with this really core group of individuals committed to bringing Eastern Zen practice to the West, committed to practices of nonviolence, organic gardening, and communal living. Mayumi lived at Green Gulch for a number of years and eventually transitioned to Hawaii, where she currently lives and works and runs, or at least is involved in a creative center, farm, and retreat that's called Ginger Hill Farm. It shares a lot of parallels with Green Gulch, though it sounds less monastic and more yoga-centered, and like a place that's open to the public. You can go, currently, it's open, it has very affordable room rates. I was looking at it this afternoon, it's like, wow, you could really go there and spend time in these beautiful little cabins. But it sounds like, again, there is this program that emphasizes getting up early in the morning, having meditation, having a green drink, going out into the garden, working in the garden. So all of the guests are really not quite required, but really recommended to partake in this particular lifestyle, to feel what it feels like to kind of be in her life, essentially, is how I translated it. So for me, it's just really exciting to be reacquainted again with an artist who's achieved so much professionally. Again, I really chose to speak about more of the cultural aspects of her work and her practice, but her work has been collected by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the collections of Yale and Princeton, the Portland Art Museum, again, pieces on permanent collection here. So her professional achievements have just been huge, but also the life that she was able to lead throughout that, being equally rich and kind of in harmony with nature and the body, is just such an inspiration to me personally, but seems like it could be a really important inspiration to this younger generation of people and artists looking to make really meaningful connections with the world around them and making art that matters, but also managing to lead a life of purpose. Yeah, that's my thoughts. There's also another book that maybe is floating around, the Gary Snyder, who's a contemporary of Mayumi Oda's. He should be a pretty familiar name to most people. This is another piece, and I highly recommend a read that sort of connects to this, what we've just been discussing, or what I've been talking about, which is the opening poem for Axe Handles. If you get a chance to take a look at that, it's a really special piece that reflects the nature of learning in a cyclical way and the importance of sort of teaching what's right at hand. So yeah, I guess we'll open it up for some questions or thoughts. Yes?
What are the pages on the table?
The pieces on the table are pieces from my studio. I brought a collection of, just a small collection of posters for each one of our classes. I had the nutty ambition to create an edition of screen prints that are fairly abstract, but that represent the whatever the class is. So this one was for Kalapuya basket weaving that we had last season. Frame loom weaving, it's that piece. And, you know, there's a handful of them up here. And so that's some aspect. There are just so many examples, and I feel like it's not current, but examples that are more contemporary to Green Gulch and San Francisco Zen Center, where artists, these amazing artists, again, were taking time to make book covers, which, I mean, I don't know, I don't see that quite in the same way these days. And, you know, taking time to make posters for events, posters for fundraising. So that's something that I do a ton of in my personal practice. They're not all amazing, but I make them and I edition them and I hang them around town. And it's funny, I've had people who, in the first year of Wildcraft, I was making posters that were a little more illustrative than this. And I was hanging them around town. They were screen prints, you know, and they were editioned. And you would run into people eventually who said, "Oh, your Wildcraft. I stole that poster off of the coffee shop board and it's hanging in my house." And there's something really, really special about that that I love. You know, of course I knew that people would do that, but there's something about getting this really tangible object that just shouldn't belong almost in the speed that we're all working at today. So, yeah, yes.
Yeah, Aaron Draper was here. I can't remember when he was here 6 months ago or a year ago, but he also did posters like that.
Oh, really?
He was talking about he wanted to have them. He was distributing sort of like you were. I think he's a local print maker, poster maker, And he had
huh.
brought a bunch, and he handed them out, and I took one home, and I said, I'm going to frame this, and he said, just line it in your cat litter box with it.
Oh my gosh.
I was like,
No. Yeah.
But it was that sort of, I'm making art to kind of give out.
Right.
And the other thing was I noticed she was topless too, which I hadn't at first, and I associate that with a kind of, I think of them as like they're gonna work. Like she's a fisherwoman, and she's about to dive, which is why she's dressed that way. She's at work, and that it's sort of a Japanese peasant dress.
Sure.
You just kind of strip down to your skirt, and now I'm gonna go work.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation too. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, huh. Nice.
So you consider yourself like a counterculture feminist or an artist? I mean,
Yeah, both. I mean,
I'm curious. I've been seeing a real divergence away from. The younger artists don't seem to have a connection with feminist art that I've seen. I certainly can't speak that broadly, but what I'll say is that the feelings and the emotions and the passion is all there, and I think there's so much hesitation to call oneself that because they don't actually know how to speak about it. They don't know how to speak about it. Younger artists, and they feel like by naming myself something. You think they're afraid of the labels?
No, I don't think they're afraid of it. I just think that it's really heavy. It's really complex. And it's also wearing a badge that you really do have to stand behind in a lot of ways. And I think that for some young people that can be really challenging to get behind that, figure out what that means for them.
Again, I would say that we've kind of lost touch with that over the last 20 years or so.
I see your point. Yeah, I see your point. Yeah, lost touch with people who can get up and say, I am a feminist, and this is why, and this is what I believe in, and be 100% behind it. Is that what you mean? Having lost touch with that?
I think there's a real need for that right now.
Sure. Yeah, always. I think there always will be. Yeah.
I have a process question.
Yes.
I'm always interested in why artists decide to do diptychs, and I can't speak for the artist, but so part of me wonders if the medium itself is sort of lending. I'm sort of picturing when you pull prints, you've got this big squeegee, and it's probably
that's exactly it.
Really, really hard to do.
Yeah.
So maybe that was the reason for the diptych, or maybe there's another.
I would venture to guess that it is purely technical and it's logistics. These prints are huge. I actually don't know if she printed her own work. I had a really hard time finding any evidence of her actually printing in the studio. From pictures of her, she's a really small person. And I know that printing, a pull that goes from here all the way down is really significant. And so basically the width that most people can handle if you're doing it by hand is just the width of your shoulders. So this would be, for me, this would be really comfortable. It would still be really challenging to make contact all the way down with the ink and the squeegee on the page. So I am confident that would be, there's a technical aspect and a logistical aspect of why one would split it up. Also finding paper that big. Finding a big piece of paper that's conducive for printmaking is really hard. The size of the screen. When I had my textile design business, I'm gonna make these 60 by 60 scarves, and the pattern on them is gonna be this thing. And so I had someone make me a screen. I couldn't even fit in the back of the truck. Sort of that moment where you realize, okay, there's a reason. You're like, think it through, okay. And it took two people, two gals on either side of them. I had a custom squeegee made, everything, two of us trying to put, consistent pressure on it. And of course, it's just a huge headache and very expensive. So I'm guessing. Yes, I'm guessing that would be why. Yes?
What did you call the ink process that kind of rainbow?
It's called split fountain printing. Yep, split fountain, and you can see it in a number like that. Piece 1, 2, 3 in from, or 4 in from the left-hand side has got 2 examples of really beautiful split fountain printing. It is a traditional Japanese technique that used to be used for woodblock primarily. Screen printing's excellent for it. I didn't bring any pieces of mine that have split fountain, but it's a sneaky way to get a lot of colors in with just one pull. So you can gradate all the way down. It's also really tricky, but it's a really nice way to be efficient with getting colors. And it is always a surprise. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So if you split fountain, why is there not green at the top? How did she get the green at the bottom? Or is that a totally different pull?
So this bright green is a different pull, is
Or
a
that's
different
a dark
layer.
green, I guess.
Nope, yep, that's the same one. So she started, how she did it, this is what I'm guessing, is that the print was actually oriented like this, not like this. And so on the left-hand side, she had that light gray lavender, and it transitioned along the squeegee to this dark green. And so the print was pulled that way, so the ink pulled like this. Yeah.
So is the ink, she puts ink all over the sheet and then, and there's an indentation in the ink, so it pools in indentations and you pull it.
No, there's a screen. There's great videos of this also on YouTube if you're really interested. There's a screen, and then below the screen is the paper, and the screen has got metal edges on it. So it holds the ink within the screen. And so she started light gray, purple, a little bit more purple, a little bit darker purple, darker green, and then pulled the squeegee over the surface of the ink and pulled the ink through the openings in the screen. And that squishes it down through the openings in the screen onto the paper.
And then would you put a second screen on and then do pass over with that?
For all the second colors, every single color you see on here is a completely different screen. Yeah, yep. And you can see it in some of these prints. It's a lot more simple. Her prints are really complex, but you can see, in some of these simple prints of mine, every layer is a completely different shape, and it's also a different screen, require a different screen. So when someone says, oh, it's a 7-color screen print, it meant there were 7 separate screens that needed to make all of those colors. So yeah, technical. The technical stuff is the fun part. Figuring out how to make it often, and I think a lot of printmakers really do, that's part of the art of it, is figuring out how to make the print you want to make. So.
As a printmaker, when you look at those, could you estimate or predict if you were going to do that, how many screens you might need?
I was sitting here trying to figure it out the other day. Yeah, I was counting out her colors, and she has a simple technique. She's not trying to create secondary and tertiary colors through overlapping, which is something I do constantly because I like to use as few screens as possible. So I'm laying down yellow, and then I'm laying down red, and then where they overlap is where I want pink or orange. Thank God. So yeah, so anyway, I would sit here and count up, okay, every time that bright green, okay, that's 1. That purple 2, orange, black, so I would guess that these are 6 to 8 color prints. Yeah. Yep.
Just having all the screens.
Yeah, well, you can wash off the design and reuse them. Yeah. So I don't ever have 8 screens in production. I probably have 3 that I burn the design on and then print, wash it off, use it again. So yeah, really fun. Really, really fun process. Any other thoughts? Ready for wine? Who isn't always ready for wine, right? Yeah, thank you for coming.